Well, I've done something that I thought I'd never do. As of this video, I am now completely caught up on the One Piece manga. After years upon years of being behind where the Japanese chapters were, I was finally able to get completely caught up to where the manga is now. All 1,000 plus chapters of it. But this isn't a video about One Piece, I already have one of those. No, instead, I'll be talking about one of my other favorite anime, and as you probably already surmised by the title of this video, I'll be talking about Yu Yu Hakusho. So, why this series specifically? Well, truth is, even though this series is about less than a ninth the length of One Piece, I only recently finished watching it all the way through for the first time, despite owning the whole series on DVD for well over a decade at this point. And I told myself, once I get caught up on One Piece, then I'll finally watch Yu Yu Hakusho all the way through. And lo and behold, here we are. So for the uninitiated, Yu Yu Hakusho is a manga series written and illustrated by Yoshihiro Togashi, which ran in Japan's Weekly Shonen Jump magazine from 1990 to 1994. You may also know Mr. Togashi as the creator of another famous Shonen Jump series, Hunter x Hunter. And yes, that is how that title is pronounced. And for as good as that series is, it's pretty infamous for its frequent long hiatuses and artwork that would occasionally get so infamously terrible later on that it got to a point where it became a meme. But I digress. Yu Yu Hakusho is the story of a teenage delinquent, Yusuke Urameshi. Normally a total dick to his friends, his teachers, even his own mother. One day, Yusuke uncharacteristically saves a child from being hit by a car and gets killed himself. Completely throwing the spirit world for a loop from this total random act of kindness, instead of judging him to go to heaven or hell, they instead make him a spirit detective, a superpowered agent who is charged with investigating demonic and supernatural activity within the world of the living, and occasionally the demon worlds. So, kinda like the Soul Reapers from Bleach, except this series didn't drag on forever. Yeah, it's kinda rich coming from a One Piece fan, isn't it? As far as the anime adaptation goes, the North American English version began airing on Adult Swim in 2002, where it aired the first 21 episodes before being moved to the Cartoon Network version of Toonami about 9 months later, in a format that was edited and censored to be suitable for slightly younger audiences. Though nowhere near to the extent of the 4Kids dub of One Piece.
Now pummel his head flatter than the shape of the earth!
This version would run until early 2005 before being yanked off of Toonami due to low ratings, until finally airing its last 24 episodes on a new time slot. Saturday mornings at 5:30. Yeah, no, I love this series, but high school me wasn't willing to wake up that early on a Saturday. The funny thing, though, I can actually recall the last episode that aired on Toonami before they pulled it. Without going into spoilers, it was the episode before Yusuke makes a pretty big sacrifice in order to defeat that story arc's main villain. I was pretty hyped for next week's episode, only to find out that it had been completely pulled from the schedule. As you can imagine, it was fairly frustrating. Though it may not have reached the same cultural phenomenon status as its Toonami contemporary Dragon Ball Z, Yu Yu Hakusho still became reasonably popular in the West while it was on the air. Apparently it even had a trading card game at one point. And with that very rough description of the anime, and its history over here in the States out of the way, what I really want to cover in this video are the 3 games that were released in the West, 2 on Game Boy Advance and 1 on PS2. In fact, when I say that these are American Yu Yu Hakusho games, I mean just that. All 3 titles were developed by American studios and were only released in North American and PAL regions as a part of a publishing deal with Atari to develop and publish Yu Yu Hakusho games outside of Japan. And for the sake of transparency, all 3 games will be played on an emulator. And I think that about covers it, so let's start with the first game of the 3. Yu Yu Hakusho Spirit Detective was released in 2003 in North America, and 2005 in Europe. and was co-developed by Sensory Sweep Studios and Screaming Games. The game follows the first 25 episodes of the anime, what's known as the Spirit Detective arc. While some liberties are taken in an effort to have it flow well as a game, many of the major scenes from the anime are here, including, for starters, Kuwabara being forbidden to fight in episode 3, Yusuke's girlfriend Keiko rescuing his body from a house fire in episode 4, and hunting down the 3 demon artifacts from episodes 5 through 8. In addition to that, the game also adapts the Genkai tournament, the 4 beasts, and the Rescue Yukina story arcs from the series. It's a little bit of a Cliff Notes version of the story, but you'll get the general gist of it while you're playing. The game does do a serviceable enough job of explaining the plot and your objectives. Spirit Detective is an isometric 2D action-adventure game with light RPG elements. The game uses the 3D models shrunk down into 2D sprites technique that was pretty common in GBA games at the time. A bit of a bold choice maybe, but that's what we ended up with. The game's graphics overall look okay, I guess. I'm sure it looks way better on an actual GBA screen than it is blown up real big on a YouTube video, but the isometric stages can make traversal tricky. It's not uncommon to get hung up on objects in the stages, and later levels can be real challenging to navigate. More on that later. Combat uses a basic 3-hit combo by pressing the A button. Each playable character also gets a special attack with the B button, and Yusuke and Kuwabara can use any combination of the L button and the face buttons. These special attacks use up the blue spirit meter that regenerates automatically. A funny thing you can do is you can attack a group of like 2 or 3 enemies at the exact same time if you group them all up just right. The combat itself can get pretty mindless. You really can just mash buttons and win. I guess I should talk about those playable characters now, shouldn't I? Throughout the story mode, there are 4 main playable characters. Yusuke, of course, and then you have his friend/rival Kuwabara and his special weapon, the Spirit Sword. Then later, you unlock the half-demon Kurama, who fights using his Rose Whip, and then, after beating him in a boss fight, you get the demon Hiei, who can teleport short distances. Each of the 4 main playable characters have their own unique stats and special abilities, like Yusuke's Spirit Gun, and Hiei being able to teleport a set distance. There is also a level where you play as Keiko, and one where you play as Botan, but they don't have the same combat abilities as the main 4. Keiko just straight up doesn't even fight. Early stages have a compass you can follow to accomplish objectives, all the while defeating enemies and gathering experience to level up, but the later ones, where you could really use it, don't. So, naturally, that makes navigating later levels rather difficult. It would have made levels such as Maze Castle, and the quick level where you play as Botan finding and destroying the Makai insects, much easier. In fact, nearly all the challenge in these later levels come from just trying to figure out where the hell you're supposed to go next. These levels don't really have any memorable landmarks, so it can get really annoying trying to navigate. Then again, I guess Maze Castle wouldn't be much of a maze if you knew which way to go at all times. The level itself is just an ugly blend of grays, so actually trying to see where you're going can get tricky. It's the ugliest level in the game, if I'm being fatally honest, but at least the one after this is pretty easy to navigate. I kinda wish there was more to talk about, but I pretty much just described everything that you're getting in this game. It's not a very long game either. I was able to finish it in under 3 hours. But you do unlock a boss rush mode when you beat the game. In this boss rush mode, you play as Yusuke's master, Genkai, who has his exact same moveset, and you go up against every boss in the game in sequential order. But that's really all there is to it. This game got ripped apart by critics, and I can see why. It may not be the worst licensed game I've ever played, but it is incredibly rough around the edges. And paying $30 for a game you can beat in less than 3 hours certainly had an effect on its critical reception. As for what I personally think about it, and if I think you should check it out, while I could definitely see younger fans getting some enjoyment out of this, I would say that this game is definitely a case of what you see is what you get. Make of that what you will. It's not even a really hard game either. I mean, aside from navigating some of the levels, the only part of the game that really gave me any trouble was the final boss fight, as you might imagine. I think it took me like 3 or 4 attempts to beat him, but yeah, that's about it. Again, I mean, it's a basic game. It's less than 3 hours long. There's just not really a whole lot to go on here. There's not really a whole lot left to talk about with this one. It just kind of is what it is, you know? And now here's the game I was honestly looking forward to playing the most when I started planning out this video. This is Yu Yu Hakusho Dark Tournament for the PlayStation 2, the only console game of the bunch. Developed by Digital Fiction, a Canadian company whose only other game that really rings a bell to me is their boxing game, Black and Bruised, which I have heard of but have never actually played for myself. They weren't around for very long, they don't even have a Wikipedia page. So anyway, Dark Tournament follows the story of the Dark Tournament story arc, following episodes 26 through 66 of the anime. Arguably the most popular story arc in the series from what I've gathered. And for good reason, there's a lot of really creative fights, and the stakes are really high in this arc. A fighting tournament of humans and demons held by corrupt wealthy humans, what's not to love? I want to start by saying that I wasn't expecting the game to open with actual scenes from the anime, same voice actors and everything. It's a good way to get people up to speed on what's going on, and a real treat for fans of the anime. Or at least for me it was. It's also pretty cool that they're using the uncut version of the English dub, which wasn't the version airing on TV at the time this game was released. I'm sure this might have come as a shock to younger fans playing this who may have been more used to the Toonami version, hearing characters swear.
You idiot! He's gonna kick your stupid ass!
I actually wasn't expecting this when I booted up this game, but Dark Tournament kinda plays like Tekken or Virtua Fighter, in which you need to remember button combinations for special attacks. Not that it matters much right here in this first fight, because you're actually supposed to lose this one. The mandatory tutorial after this makes you go over the controls and whatnot before you can progress, so it's good that the game doesn't leave you to your own devices when going over its gameplay. But I found it can get real annoying if you suck at tournament-style fighting games like I do. It's around here you're going to notice a major flaw with the gameplay. The controls feel really stiff and sticky. They feel slow and kind of delayed. I thought it was the emulator I was using not being all that great, but I looked up other reviews of this game, and apparently no, that's just a common complaint people had with this game. And that's something that has heavy ramifications on the rest of the game. This is just the tutorial, and I was having trouble perfecting the combos. And what's frustrating about this is I don't know how much of this is because of the game, and how much of it is just the fact that I'm terrible at fighting games. When you're not battling stiff, seemingly unresponsive controls, you're battling the opponent characters from the show, each with their own unique gimmick. One match may have you unable to use your spirit powers, and another will be a one-on-one slapfest where neither one of you can move from a predetermined spot. And some will even be tag matches with a group of 2 or 3 of you against a single enemy, or a group of them. These are fun because enemies love to switch places while you're in the middle of a combo. That gets annoying. But hey, at least the audio sting that plays whenever a character tags out is an audio sting from the anime, so that's pretty cool. In fact, speaking of audio, like I stated earlier, the game contains all the same voice actors from the English dub. And while I personally think that's great, watching Yu Yu Hakusho in English is my preferred way of watching it. Some may cry foul over the lack of a Japanese voice track. But that's kinda how anime games were back in the early to mid-2000s, especially games based on anime that were being licensed in the West. So it's kinda the opposite issue of anime games today, where there's Japanese audio but no English audio, like with the One Piece games. No, I'm not letting that go. I'll always be bitter about that until the day I die. And while it's definitely a treat to hear all the actors from the dub here, hearing Koto's commentary during gameplay may get a bit annoying, as she does tend to repeat dialogue pretty frequently. Heck, the game's visuals aren't half bad either for a PS2 game from 2004. Like many other games based off of anime, it uses cel-shaded visuals, which were pretty much in style around this time. The game all around does look pretty alright, though it is weird not seeing any facial animations on any of the characters. They'll be knocked around and all you'll see is just their static, unblinking faces the entire time. That's That's kind of weird. But sadly, this game being Yu Yu Hakusho themed does very little to save it from the frustrating gameplay. Not only are the controls unintuitive and sluggish, but it seemed to me anyway that the game loves to throw bullcrap enemy AI at you, especially when it looks like you're winning. I've had opponents come around and whoop me when it looked like I was winning, and other times they flat out curb stomped me. Like, the earliest real fights in this game were giving me a surprisingly hard time, requiring multiple retries. I hate to admit this, but in an effort to make any kind of progress, I actually lowered the difficulty. And even then, I would still struggle to win fights. I hold no delusions of being good at fighting games, but I've played other fighting games before and have never had as much trouble winning as I did here. Like, I look like I'm playing like shit, but I'm genuinely trying my best here. Like, I've actually had a way easier time playing online matches with actual human beings in other games than I had against the AI in this game. And these are just regular battles without any special gimmicks, like this guy who can stretch his limbs out. Oh god, did I even mention the spirit powers? Well, you use them with the shoulder buttons, but even on the game's lowest difficulty setting, I found that enemies would just block them anyway. On that note, it's weird how you have to actively unsheath your weapons when you're playing as, for example, Kurama or Hiei. Their weapons are their signature weapons from the show, and it's extremely rare for them to ever be shown fighting hand-to-hand, so it's weird to see them doing it here. And honestly, kind of unneeded. Just let them have their weapons by default. I don't know if I can recommend this game to Yu Yu Hakusho fans, or even fans of 3D tournament fighters. I could be wrong, but it doesn't seem like the core gameplay is designed all that well. The controls and unbalanced difficulty kill what would have otherwise been a decent little fighter. If you want a good tournament fighter on PS2, play Virtua Fighter 4 instead. That game's actually designed well and has more to offer. Alright, so we have one game that's kinda okay, I guess, and one that's incredibly flawed and borderline unenjoyable, in my opinion. We got one more game to look at, and it's actually a strategy RPG. How bad could they screw this one up? But who knows, maybe third time will be the charm. And we're actually headed back to the Game Boy Advance for this one. Yu Yu Hakusho Tournament Tactics. Released in the US just 2 months after Dark Tournament on the PS2, and developed once again by Sensory Sweep and Screaming Games, the teams behind Spirit Detective. It's also the only E-rated game of the 3 games, so that's pretty funny. Once again taking place in the Dark Tournament arc, Tournament Tactics is a turn-based strategy RPG in a similar vein to Final Fantasy Tactics or Disgaea. Each individual segment of the world map houses about 7 or 8 levels, and as you can probably imagine, the general gameplay loop involves going into these levels with a total of 5 teammates, and most of the time, you'll be wiping out all of the enemies on the map. I'm skipping ahead a little, but there are a total of 10 playable characters you can use. The first 5 being from Team Urameshi, and the other ones being members of other teams that will join you, usually after you beat them in their boss fights. And Hiei's sister, Yukina. You've got characters that specialize in close-range combat, ones that are proficient in long-range attacks, and ones that are capable of using a little of both. And you have Yukina, who's the dedicated healer type. But you can usually just pick whichever characters you want to use and get by just fine. More on that later. Now let's talk a little about the actual meat of the game, the combat. Nearly every attack in the game uses a character's spirit energy. Yes, even melee attacks. It sounds like a pain in the ass, especially since there are no shops in the game to buy recovery items at. Stick a pin in that, we'll be returning to that point. But the game does try to alleviate this by giving you special abilities in your focus menu, Mend and Charge. Mend to recover HP at the cost of some of your spirit energy, and Charge to recover spirit energy. From the same menu, you can also taunt nearby enemies to draw their attention onto the character taunting and away from others, and Defend, which cuts down on the amount of damage taken at the cost of some spirit energy. Turns usually go like this. When it's your character's turn, you're given the option to move a certain amount of space depending on that character's movement stat. Characters are only allowed to move, attack, use items, or use a focus command once per turn. And whenever a turn ends without a character attacking, you're allowed to face that character in a certain direction. This is important because you do not want to be facing away from an enemy, as attacks inflicted directly from behind causes extra damage. On that note, trying to attack an enemy from behind them is also a viable strategy, as cowardly as that sounds. You also get one final special ability known as Overdrive, which builds the more you land successful hits. When this is selected, it'll supercharge one of your attacks and do incredible amounts of damage. Very handy to use against boss fights and other tough encounters. And as you can also probably imagine, defeat enough enemies and you'll level up. You're rewarded with a handful of skill points every time you level up, and you can allocate them to 4 areas. Offense, which increases your attack power, Spirit Energy, which increases your max Spirit Energy and unlocks new attacks, Movement, which allows you to move more space on the board, and Power, which increases your max HP. While all of these stats are important, you're definitely going to want to dump some points into Spirit Energy because all of your attacks rely on it. And it's a good idea to level up as much as you can because these enemies are spongy. The regular encounters aren't too hard, but I've had several moments where I attacked an enemy with a special move, only for that enemy to hold on to 1 HP and survive. Also worth mentioning is that this game has friendly fire, meaning your attacks that hit in a certain range can end up damaging an ally if they're in your line of fire. And healing spells that have an AoE effect can end up healing enemies, so these are all things you'll need to take into consideration. There are recovery items in the game, but like I alluded to earlier, there's no shop system and no in-game currency. So recovery is all regulated to those focus commands and Yukina's healing spells. The only way to get items is to win them in this spinning wheel minigame at the end of levels, but it seems to only appear at random. I'm not entirely sure how to get this. And even then, characters have a limit as to how many items they can hold at a time, and the game never explains to me how to increase this. This is honestly one of those instances where I wish I had the instruction manual. That might have told me how some of these things work that the game doesn't tell you. It would have been really helpful having items that remove status ailments from you, because there are enemies in the game whose regular attacks have a high chance of inflicting poison on you, which if you don't have a certain curative item for, it looks like you have to wait a few turns for it to wear off. Which can get annoying because there's always multiple enemies that can poison you, and you won't have enough poison cures to feasibly combat it. Major stumbling point for this game, in my opinion. Though if any of your characters do succumb to poison and are knocked out, they automatically come back after the level is cleared, though with only half of their health and spirit energy. So make sure you're preparing yourself there accordingly. I mentioned that most of the levels involve just wiping out all of the enemies, but that's not the only kinds of levels this game gives you. For starters, you may be tasked with taking out what the game calls floodgates, which will infinitely respawn enemies if you take any of them out. They usually spawn in 2 extra enemies per floodgate, and a level will have a minimum of 2 of them you'll need to destroy. These can get a bit tricky since you'll still need to handle the enemies that spawn in to finish the level, and if the floodgates spawn in a lot of them, then that's just more cleanup you'll have to do after you do eventually destroy the floodgates. These aren't too bad, but they can drag a while if they spawn in too many enemies. There's also levels where you'll have to defeat all of the enemies within a time limit, and there's levels where you'll have to make it to a certain tile on the level in order to clear it. But the ones I personally dreaded in particular are the pursuit levels, where you'll have to catch up to and defeat a particular enemy before they make it to a tile at the end of the level. If they do, you fail the entire level and it's back to the title screen with you. So make sure you're saving at the end of every level, because this is one of those games that'll kick you back to your last save if you get a game over. I do wish that the game did the Fire Emblem thing, where you're able to move all of your teammates at the same time, then the enemy gets their turns at the same time, and then it switches back to you. Instead, enemies will take turns in between your characters, and when you really just want to take your next turn, you'll often be waiting for multiple enemies to finish their turns. If you're impatient like I am, this can feel like more of a drag than it realistically is. A fast forward button would have been really nice, and while yes, I did play this on an emulator, people playing it on physical hardware aren't as lucky. I would say that that's the gameplay loop in a nutshell, but that would imply that there's more to it than what I just described. This game knows exactly what it's trying to be and doesn't really try to go extracurricular and be anything more than just a solid strategy RPG experience. And for the most part it is, but I couldn't help but feel some monotony during long gameplay sessions. This is a game that I find to be at its best in short bursts. Though maybe I brought that on myself because I'm making a video about it. The game does take a few liberties with the Dark Tournament story to have it flow better as a game, mostly in the way you get your teammates. Rinku has to be unlocked by rescuing him from demons, which doesn't happen in the anime. Not to mention, Yukina even participating in the Dark Tournament at all is just wrong. Just saying though, soon as you get enough characters and can replace Kuwabara, do so immediately. He's kind of the worst character in the game. No real hard-hitting moves and terrible movement stat, even at max level. Damn shame, Kuwabara just can't catch a break. Though probably the biggest liberty this game takes is the return of the 4 Saint Beasts from way before the Dark Tournament arc. They appear in a bonus dungeon that only unlocks after you get all of your characters to level 32, the game's level cap. I'm gonna leave that up to you whether you want to go the extra mile for this bonus dungeon, but what I will say is that the fight against the last one, Suzaku, is probably harder than the final fight against Toguro. It's probably neck and neck though, because the last fight with Toguro has 2 phases, and in the last one, you only have Yusuke available. And again, if you go down, it's game over, and it's back to your last save, wherein you'll have to do that first battle all over again. So yeah, you're probably gonna have to grind a little. And I think that about covers Yu Yu Hakusho tournament tactics. As far as SRPGs go, it probably won't blow you away, and it is a little rough around the edges, but overall, I can still recommend at least checking it out if you like both Yu Yu Hakusho and strategy RPGs. There are some things I wish the game had done a little bit differently, like its inventory system and how slow some battles can be at times. But I find that Yu Yu Hakusho translates surprisingly decently into a strategy RPG. Though I gotta ask, why did neither of these games set during the Dark Tournament feature the Best Announcer Girl jury? What the hell? And that's it. Those were the 3 Yu Yu Hakusho games that were made by North American developers. All released within about a year and some change of each other. I know that they still made Yu Yu Hakusho games after this, and Yusuke appeared in other games such as... And apparently they made a mobile game that came out back in 2018 that I didn't even know about until I was finishing this script. Huh. I won't be looking at that one. Anyway, they would make a few more Yu Yu Hakusho games on the PS2, but until that one mobile game, all fans would get is Yusuke cameos in Shonen Jump collaborative efforts. If I could speak personally for a moment, I think enough time has passed to where it'd be really cool to get a brand new console game retelling the story of the series. Kinda like what they're doing now with the Dragon Ball Z and Naruto games. I mean, hell, if Bandai Namco can get away with exhuming Dragon Ball Z's corpse for new games every single year, why can't someone do the same for a new Yu Yu Hakusho game? Like, maybe making an action brawler style game like the Yakuza games or something. Wishful thinking, I guess. I will say, though, that the games we do have presently are kind of a mixed bag. Some of these may appeal to you, and others might not. Like, for example, I found Dark Tournament hard as hell for the wrong reasons, but oddly enough found the 2 GBA games somewhat decent. All I can say there is try them and decide for yourself which ones you like, if any. I just spent the entirety of a YouTube video doing just that. But above all else, watch the anime. The anime is genuinely good, and it's only 112 episodes long. And with that, it's time to start wrapping up the video. If you made it all the way to the end, I want to thank you for watching. I've been prepping and gathering footage for this video for nearly an entire year now, and I'm glad to finally have it off the back burner and done. If you'd like to see another video like this, here's the one I did on the One Piece games that were released when 4Kids Entertainment was in charge of the English dub. If you want to see my newest videos as soon as they're live, then consider subscribing. And if you'd like to support the channel in a more direct way, I have a link to my Cash app in the description below. Just leave the name you want to be credited as in the notes on there, and you'll get a verbal shoutout at the beginning of my next video. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.